Okay, in this screencast, we're going to learn about how soil forms and how it is related to a process known as ecological succession. Well, let's get started. Most people, when they think of soil, they just think of the word dirt, and they don't have much appreciation for it. I think most people just think of dirt as something kind of gross, something you need to wash off. It's just something that's there. They don't really give much thought, but actually, it turns out is one of those vitally important things to human survival. Soil, I'd prefer to call it rather than dirt, is an amazingly important part of ecology. So let's just look at some of the things we get at what we call the ecological benefits or ecosystem services provided by soil. Okay, so let's just start with this. If you ever pick up a shovel of soil, one thing you're going to notice it's heavy because it's got a lot of water in it. So one of the most important things about soils is it stores a lot of water and makes it available to plants long after it rains. And when it rains, what happens is the rainwater will percolate down through the soil. And as it does so, the impurities that might be trapped within it tend to get filtered out so that soil purifies rainwater, making it completely drinkable by the time it joins groundwater. Another thing that happens in soil is that it tends to cycle nutrients that are essential to plant growth. So, phosphorus and nitrogen cycle, especially when you consider most of the bacteria associated with the nitrogen cycle live here. Uh, and the other thing is and here's why it's so important to humans, is that our food web is based on terrestrial green plants, and terrestrial plants need soil in order to grow. They just don't grow without it. And so for that reason, without soils, there aren't humans. And if you look at places that don't have much in the way of soil, you don't have much in the way of human life either. So love soils. Now, soils serve as this very vast near surface water reservoir. So it rains, okay? And if it wasn't for soil, plants would be able to live when it was raining, but as soon as it stopped raining, they start getting thirsty. They couldn't do photosynthesis and they die. But what happens is because the particles in soil have the ability to hold on to water, then what we find is that long after it rained, months and months after it rained, almost a year after it rained, you can still have moisture contained in that soil for plants to grow on. So it's this great way of keeping water available for long periods of times. Now, the ability of soil to do this is mostly a function of the particle sizes. So the general idea is the smaller the particle size, the more surface area there is. It has a greater surface area to volume ratio, and since water tends to cling to the surface of these particles because of electrostatic forces, capillary action, the smaller the particle size, the more water it can hold. All right. And it is worth noting, this is pretty wild. When you think of fresh water, you probably think of rivers, but way, way, way more of the fresh water on the planet is caught up in soils than in rivers. Rivers are just a tiny fraction. Soils are pretty significant. Now, as I said, soil is super important to us personally because all vascular plants that grow on land depend on it because they put their roots down in it and they use these spaces between these particles for their roots to breathe and extract water. So because our food webs are based on it, it makes it a pretty darn important thing. It's something that we need to know a lot about because it turns out humans are not being very good about conserving soil, and soil conservation is vital to human survival. Now, another thing I'd like to say is again, don't think of soil as dirt. It's actually a living, breathing thing. I mean, there's so much life present in soil that just goes, past most people. All right, but in soil, there's all kinds of microbes. There's hundreds of thousands. There's millions of different microbes. Some of them are bacterial. Some of them are fungal. Some of them are single-celled organisms, eukaryotes. But there's insects. There's insect larvae. Like here, you have worms, obviously, and you have mammals. There's all kinds of things that live inside the soil. So it's not just dirt. It's this living layer that exists between the bedrock and the atmosphere. Now, a very important thing about soils has to do with what we call porosity. So, the pore space is basically the space that is not occupied by mineral particles. So, what we find in soil is basically made of these tiny particles of minerals: quartz, feldspar, clay, okay? And in between them, there's these empty spaces, and these empty spaces tend to be mostly filled with air. And then clinging to the surface of the particles, shown in blue here, is water that's adhering to the surface of those. Now, here's what's so important about this. Plant roots grow into these pores. And what they do is these pores have air in them, so it allows the plant roots to breathe, to respire. They need oxygen just like you do in order to live, right? But they also are able to extract water from the surfaces of these. All right. Let's see what else. Okay, so how does soil get here in the first place? Where did it come from? Okay, so it's actually pretty fascinating. Okay, so it turns out that it's a process that is fairly well known. So we start off with bare rock. Okay, bedrock we'll call it. And what happens is mechanical weathering occurs. So mechanical weathering means that cracks will form, and then water will get in those cracks, and over time, different processes will break these rocks. We talked about before, like ice wedging will happen. Plant roots will grow into here, and this will tend to break the rocks up in what we call in situ, in place. Okay, so this picture here is this exact same rock, except what's happened is mechanical weathering broke it into smaller pieces, and then chemical weathering turns some of those other minerals that were not quartz into clays. So now I have clays that are surrounding these larger chunks of rock. And we also have little particles of sand and silt in here as well. And so as time goes by, after the mechanical weathering is done, chemical weathering will turn more and more and more of the particles that can turn into clay, leaving behind the sand and the silt particles. But in addition, what we'll have is organic matter from dead plant matter will get mixed in with it up in the top layer. So what we find is that we have bedrock down below that breaks up into smaller and smaller pieces until eventually it becomes what we call soil. And then as we get towards the top of the soil, it becomes more enriched in organic matter. And that's where all the living parts of the soil will be found. Then we have this little layer of decaying matter on top of it. Okay, so how do we get this process going from here to here? How do we break it up? Okay, so basically it's mechanical weathering. So basically it cracks because of temperature changes. It gets hot in the day, it gets cold at night, the rock expands, the rock contracts, and that causes cracks to form. Water gets into these cracks, and that allows for chemical weathering to happen. But in the wintertime, when water gets in there, we get ice wedging. The ice forms, it gets larger, just like a can of soda in the freezer, and it pushes the rocks apart. Now roots will grow inside here, and as the roots grow in here, they'll further break it apart. And then you can also get abrasion. Now, abrasion is basically when it's being transported. Now, we'll mostly consider soils that are forming in place. But it is worth noting that soils can move. You can move material from one place to another by the action of a river or wind and deposit it as soil elsewhere. But we're going to focus just on soils that form in place. So when we look at soils, we notice that it's important to think in terms of particle size, because particle size determines how much water can be retained, and it also determines whether those pores are able to allow water to flow through. All right, and so it turns out that if we just think in terms of particle size, we have gravels are the largest, so we're talking a couple centimeters or larger. Then we have sand, silt, and clay as we get smaller and smaller. Now, clay minerals are formed usually by chemical weathering. So what we find is when rocks are exposed to water, especially water that has a low pH, a little bit acidic, that and oxygen from the atmosphere, that there are certain minerals that are just not stable in that environment, and they begin to react, and they weather chemically into what we call clay minerals, which are then tend to get washed away. And if you just go out here in Korea, you see all the time. My wife and I hike like every weekend. You'll see a rock. It looks like rock, but you can touch it. You can scrape off, and your hand is red. That's clay. It's just it is literally this chemical weathering happening right before our eyes, soil forming right before our eyes. Now, this process is slow. I mean, it depends on a number of things, like what kind of bedrock we're talking about, the pH of the water we're dealing with, what kind of plants grow, whatever, right? The temperature variations. But ultimately, let's just deal with this. It takes many hundreds to several thousands of years to turn bedrock into a fully established soil horizon. Thousands of years. Now, what that tells us is we have to think of soil as a non-renewable resource. If we lose this, we can't just get it back. We can't just make more soil. We have what we have. So a non-renewable resource is like coal. Like once you burn coal, it's gone. Can coal be made? Yeah, plants make coal, but it takes millions of years for coal to get made. We can't exactly sit around and wait, so it's non-renewable. Same with soils. Soils are forming right now, but they take thousands of years, so we can't wait. We have to conserve what we have right now because once it's gone for human purposes, it's gone. I think I'm going to sneeze, so forgive me if I do soon. I feel a little tickle in my nose. Told you I was going to sneeze. That's the first time I ever sneezed during a screencast. Okay, now the uppermost layer of soil, and we could get into like super details and talk about the A, B, C, O horizon, whatever, but we're just going to talk about this. The upper layer of soil is called topsoil, and this is where all that living goodness happens, right? This is where all the nutrients are cycling, where all the different microbes live, where most of the nutrients are extracted by plants. Plants get down here for water, but they get their nutrients up here. Now, so this is an area where we have both mineral material and organic material that's formed from the decaying of these fallen plant materials like leaves and dead grasses up here. And again, this topsoil is really important because that's where nutrient cycling happens. It's important for humans because this is what we use for growing our crops. Now, as we said before, so as water passes through here, it's going to filter out these impurities, and by the time it gets down here, that water will be fairly pure. It'll become groundwater and flow away. But it's also worth noting that inside this body of soil, there's these clay particles, and these clay particles are really extraordinarily good at holding on to both impurities, keeping them from getting to the groundwater, and holding on to water and making them available for plants to grow. So it's important for soils to have some clay in them, but if they have too much, the problem is the water can't pass through them. Now, between the topsoil and the bedrock, which is the parent rock material from which this soil is being derived, we find is there's less organic material here, more in the way of clay particles and larger rocks. This is really the part of the soil that trees grow down to extract the water, but there's not a lot of nutrient value in this part of the soil. So basically, just think we got bedrock, we have topsoil, and we have the in-between soil. And the in-between soil is really more of a water reservoir for plants rather than a nutrient reservoir. Okay, now, soil type plays a really important role in determining what's going to grow on land. So we find is this. I'll give you a few examples here, okay? So what makes soil productive for plant growth, for farming, okay? So volcanic soils formed out of volcanic rocks, they tend to have a lot of phosphorus in them. And because of that, phosphorus is one of the main limiting factors in plant growth. So volcanic soils have a lot of it. You can get nitrogen from the nitrogen cycle from bacteria, but you can't get phosphorus that way. Phosphorus hasn't come from the rocks, and volcanic rocks have a lot of it. So you find people like to farm where there's volcanoes. A lot of people are like, why do people keep building farms where they're going to get killed by volcanoes? Well, it's because it grows such great crops. Now, grasslands, same thing. Grasslands have fantastic soil, and that's because there's a lot of organic matter present, and that organic matter does provide a lot of nutrients, both phosphorus and nitrogen, because it's just getting recycled in there. So you find that most of the world's large produce exporting companies were originally grassland biomes, like the United States and Russia, and it's just that soil is uniquely rich in nutrients and ideal for growing crops. But at the same time, you can't get these soils back, and these two countries have not been particularly great about managing their soils. But now here's something that might surprise you. Rainforest soils are actually very terrible. They're very low in nutrients, which really would surprise you. But the reason is this. There's so much animal life in a rainforest that when plant matter falls down from trees, it gets consumed by animals rather than getting returned into that layer of topsoil. So before you can get in the topsoil, it gets used. So most of the nutrient value in the forest is currently in use by organisms. So it's not just sitting in the soils. The other thing is what nutrients are in the soils tend to get leached out. That means like when rain comes down, these things are water soluble and they just get carried down into the groundwater. So the soils in rainforests are unfortunately very poor at growing plants. So obviously plants do grow there, But if you just took that soil and tried to grow more plants, you'd find it's not really good at it at all. These plants are there because they've had a long, long, long time to establish themselves. Now let's talk about disruptions. So an ecological disruption means that we took a pre-existing plant community, or just community really, but we'll just focus on this one, the plants, and we disrupt it somehow. We basically wipe it down to either bare rock or bare soil. Okay, we basically get rid of the plant community. So how does this happen? Okay, so it happens a number of ways. Forest fires, a powerful forest fire, man, all the trees, everything's gone. There's just dirt afterwards. Lava flows. Lava flow comes through, catches the trees on fire, it burns them up. Afterwards, it's just this. It looks like just rock. Okay, that's all it is. A tsunami. When a tsunami washes through an area, it often picks up absolutely every piece of vegetation and carries it out to sea, and what's left behind is just dirt. Landslides, same thing. When a landslide comes down a mountainside, a lot of the material that when it gets to the bottom, it just buries everything under a layer of rock and rubble. Advancing glaciers. So when glaciers move forward, they're like bulldozers. They're just big walls of ice, and they move down valleys. Or in the case of ice ages, they just move across continents. And as they do, they just blast everything out of their way. So if you could go into watch a time lapse of the last ice age happening, you had these wonderful, boreal forests, these taiga areas, and these glaciers just came, and they just basically just took everything out. And then when they melted away, there's just nothing but bare rock. Okay, so that's clearly a disruption to that ecosystem. But then humans can cause disruptions as well. So we go and we build a parking lot. Clearly, there's no trees there. There was trees. Now there's a parking lot. That's a disruption. Or agricultural development. There was a forest. We cleared it out. We put in a farm. Now there may be things growing there, but that's not the natural community that would be there. Okay, so all of these would be examples of what we call a disruption to the plant community that should be found in that area. And the reason this is worth noting is because it leads to a concept called ecological succession, which is a really cool concept. And basically, ecological succession is the process by which a disrupted biological community goes back to its previous state. This is what it would look like if there was no disruption. So in other words, if I just leave it alone, over time, it's going to take on a certain look. A disruption happens, it doesn't look that way, but after a time, succession occurs, it goes back to where it was. Now, the reason it's called succession is because there's this succession of plant communities that happen in a pretty predictable fashion, starting with the very smallest of plants, like little annual plants that live for like 1 year, then plants and grass that live for several years, and then shrubs, and then softwood trees like pine trees, and then tall hardwood trees. So what you'll notice here is each successive community, which makes up the ecological succession, is taller and is outcompeting the ones before it for shade. So basically, these plants were able to grow and outcompete these plants. So these plants died off, and now we have shrubs. But then these ones were able to grow and get taller than these, and then they spread out, and they put these ones out of business, and these ones grew even taller, and they outcompeted these. But nothing grows taller than them, so succession stops when I get to these hardwood forests. If that's the biome that supports it, this would be true for a deciduous forest biome. So let's just look at one example I could give you of ecological succession. In this case, it would be a anthropogenic disruption. Farmers come in, they look at this forest, they go, you know what, we're going to chop down this forest and we're going to make a farm. I mean, this is what happened when Europeans got to North America. It was all pristine. Like the biome was the way it was supposed to be. The native population, the humans who lived there before that, the Native Americans, they did very little in the way of disrupting. Then once in a while, they would start fires, but for the most part, no, they lived within it. Well, Europeans came in, chop it all down, turn it to dirt, turn the dirt over and plant. Okay, well, let's just say here's what happened. Okay, that's a disruption. Okay, forest is not there now. Now let's just say humans go extinct because they don't listen to their environmental science teachers. They go, whatever, yeah, right. Okay, they ignore it, and humans go extinct. Okay, and look, I mean, I hate to say this, guys, but the odds are pretty good that humans will go extinct. If we can't figure this out, we'll put ourselves out of business. Now, I'm hoping that we can turn it around. But good Lord, we got to figure this out, and we got to figure it out pretty quick. But let's just say we don't, and we go extinct. What would happen? Well, after a while, that farmland isn't going to be farmland. Guess what'll happen? All right, farmer goes extinct. All right, now I got this dirt here, right? Well, then grasses start to grow, and then shrubs start to grow, and then small trees, and then bigger trees. And the next thing you know, it's back to what it was before the Europeans arrived in North America. That's the idea behind ecological succession. And it's pretty awesome. Okay, so basically what happens is After disruption, these plant communities establish themselves, and they have to start with what we call pioneer species. So a pioneer species is one that can live in whatever that initial afterscape is. Okay, so especially if you think about like an advancing glacier melts. Okay, now I just have just rock. Okay, or a lava flow. There's just rock. All right, or after humans go extinct, it's just pavement. Okay, well, some species are going to be able to grow on there. We call this pioneer species. Eventually, these pioneer species get outcompeted by taller grasses and these intermediate transitional species, right? But eventually, these get outcompeted, and eventually, we end up with what we call a climax community. And a climax community, depending on the biome, is likely to be these tall hardwood trees. Now, obviously, that's not going to be if it's a grassland biome. It's not going to be if it's a tundra or a desert biome. But many biomes, that's what you get. Okay, so the idea is you go from pioneer species to transitional species to a climax community. And once you reach a climax community, no more change happens. Let's just talk a little bit more about pioneer species. So pioneer species are basically they're ones that don't require soil. Okay, they're able to grow on pretty much bare rock. And that really comes down to two categories of organisms. One is called lichens. If you walk in the mountains, you'll see rocks that have these weird things growing on them. These are called lichens. Back in Washington State, where I'm from, you just see them everywhere, right? The healthy air helps them exist. Now, the other thing you get is mosses. Like here's these green things here are mosses. Okay, so mosses and lichens are able to grow without soil, and for that reason, they're pioneer species. But what happens is as they die, the organic matter that's in them starts to pile up, and it starts to form the basis for soil. Okay, now soil requires both organic matter and the mineral components. But anyway, it starts with these pioneer species. And by the way, pioneer species also help with mechanical weathering, right? They have like, if not roots, they have roots, and they also have like structures that hold onto the rock, and it tends to chip away at the rock over time. Now, what happens is once soil finally becomes established through mechanical weathering and the buildup of organic matter from decomposing pioneer species, we start to get these transitional species, annual plants, grasses, whatever, live for 1 year. Then there's ones that live for a few years, like taller grasses and shrubs. And then over time, you get bigger and bigger things growing. You start to get small trees, each one of them outcompeting the one before them in terms of its ability to grow taller and have access to sunlight. But in order to do that, that usually means they have to have more soil. So really, this progression of succession is dependent on the rate at which soil can become established to greater and greater depths. So whereas lichens don't need any depth of soil, annual plants and grasses might need just a little bit. Shrubs need about this much. Trees need more and more. So, but once it's there, then those trees are going to outgrow and outcompete the other plants. They'll shade them out, and they end up, winning. And then eventually, you get the biggest trees of all, and then they outcompete everything else, and then nobody outcompetes them, and we call that a climax community for that biome. So once again, a climax community is one in which the competition for sunlight is done. These are the biggest trees that exist. Nothing can outcompete them. They win. They don't face any other challenges. And so this community can stay in its state that it's in indefinitely. As long as climate change doesn't make it so it's a different biome, they'll just stay there forever. So you can think of a climax community as being sort of the end point in the succession game. But keep in mind that it is determined by the biome. So for instance, in a rainforest or a deciduous forest, you can have these tall hardwoods that form a canopy and outshade everything underneath them. So once you get to this point, it stays here. But in a grassland biome, this is a climax community, right? It started off with lichens, whatever, but it couldn't get any more than grass because of the limiting factor of water. There just wasn't enough water to get bigger plants to grow. So this is the climax community. In a taiga, normally, like in a say a deciduous forest, like here in Korea, these trees here, these pine trees, they're a transitional species. They're a late stage transitional species that will eventually get outcompeted by hardwood trees. But in a taiga, the soils just don't get that deep enough, and there's not the ability to establish these root systems for these tall trees, so it doesn't get beyond this. So these softwood conifers become the climax community there. All right, almost done here. There's two types of succession. There's what we call primary succession, and then there's secondary succession. Primary succession involves the colonization of bare rock, and so like we don't have any soil to start with. So we're talking about after a lava flow or volcanic eruption, um, after a tsunami washed away everything down to bare rock. You had a glacier come along, or you have basically people have built a parking lot. Okay, so there's no soil. So that's where primary succession occurs. Secondary succession means the soil is already established, but everything that was living there got taken away. So this could be like a forest fire. It could be a lake filling with sediment over time, or like in a windstorm knocks down a bunch of trees in a climax forest, and then you got this debris field. Well, things are going to start growing out of that. But the deal is with secondary succession, the soil is already established, so that really changes the pace at which these succeeding plant communities can establish themselves. So let's just look at it in terms of primary succession. With primary succession, remember I start off with bare rock. The glacier retreated. Okay. Now I just have bare rock. What's going to happen is lichens and mosses are going to establish themselves here. This period here can last a long time, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, depending on climate conditions, right? But eventually we'll start establishing a small layer of soil. And once we do, we'll start getting small annual plants growing. These little tiny things that don't need much soil at all. The soil gets a little bit deeper. I get taller, longer lasting ones. Now I have like grasses and perennial plants that maybe live for 4 years. And eventually what happens is the soil gets a little bit deeper. Now I can support bigger shrubby kind of trees, right? And they'll outcompete the other ones and grow taller. And as the soil gets deeper, the roots can get deeper, and I can get taller trees forming. And now the softwood conifer trees will outcompete these shrubs. And eventually, if we're in the right community here, the right biome, then these very large hardwood trees that need deep root systems can grow up and outcompete the other ones. And once I get to there, I'm done. I'm at my climax community. But the thing is, this process to get from bare rock to climax community is slow. It says here hundreds of years, but in reality, it's often thousands of years it takes to get that. Now, compare to the secondary succession. Secondary succession, look, oh, there's a forest fire. Okay, now I don't have anything growing here. But look what I've got. I've got all this dirt. Sorry, I called it dirt. We have all this lovely soil. Okay, and so what happens is, over time, annual plants are going to start to grow. You can see here, this is like the original layer. We're going to get the same progression of small annual plants to perennials to shrubs to softwoods to hardwoods. The exact same progression happens here as happened here. The difference is the soil was already established. So that initial time period here that took, hundreds and hundreds to maybe thousands of years, it didn't have to happen. So I just go, and I get to here in from a geologic perspective, a short time period, like less than 200 years. And the last thing I'll talk about is succession. This is kind of a cool thing. It happens with ponds. So ponds are like these small, shallow depressions that have water in them, like fish and frogs, whatever, right? But they tend over time to fill up with sediment, lava, just like the debris from dead plants, right? And also, after like runoff will carry soil into here, and it will, the sediment will fill up. Eventually, these things do tend to fill in with sediment, and as they do, what happens is you end up with all this thick layer of soil that doesn't have a community of plants established on it. So it will eventually end up going through the same stages, but they tend to happen from the outside in this case. But you'll find sometimes you'll be in the middle of a hardwood forest, and there'll be this circular area that doesn't have hardwood trees. It's got shrubs and maybe softwood conifers. And like, oh, this used to be a pond. All right. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in class. Oh, I got to figure out how to turn this thing off now. I had to switch. It's kind of annoying. My computer that I used to use doesn't work anymore. So now I got to figure out how to turn this thing off every time. It's such a pain.